Welcome, everybody. Thank you. Our two speakers will be introduced. I'm introducing Bill, and Brian is introducing Andrew in alphabetical order. Anyway, I will wait for these people to come sit down. Welcome. And Bill, I think you and I have known each other since the 70s when you were curator at the Whitney.
Earlier than that, Joan, 1967.
Okay.
So that's like 50.
1 years.
1 year is going on too, yeah.
And we spent one memorable afternoon in Bolotowsky's studio when we were introduced to something I equate with white lightning called pepper vodka. And I don't know that I don't remember much more than that. Anyway, Bill went on to Pasadena where he was director of the museum, and then Houston where he was director, and then he came back to New York where he was, I gotta get this straight, meanwhile he wrote two books that are relevant to this. One book was Modern Art in America, 1908 to 1960, and the other was 1930 to 1968, Paintings and Sculpture in America. So Bill can mix these into the history. But he's now emeritus, but he was Evelyn Crane's Cossack Professor of Art History at Hunter College, right?
Right.
Brian?
Hi, I'm Brian Washburn. I'm here to introduce Ilya Bolotowsky's son, Andrew Bolotowsky.
I'm the other guy up
He's
here.
the other guy up here. And
Not to confuse us.
very well versed in his father's history, his father's life, and we're always grateful to have Andrew call us and say, "Hello, this is Andrew Bolotowsky." You all know you're a font of a lot of knowledge,
Oh, well,
and we do appreciate it.
sometimes.
Sometimes. But it was very interesting as Bill and I were cramming down lunch at the Star 18 diner down the street. We were discussing with fascination of the period of your father's life in Constantinople at the age of 14, where he went to St. Joseph's. And then at 16 emigrated to the United States. And we were wondering how that affected his visual life and what he brought into his painting from that time period. A gap. And sometimes what our jobs and Bill's job is, we try to fill in the gaps in time. So that was question number one that we were kind of puzzled about. Ilya's take on things when the Europeans started pouring in and escaping the Nazis in Europe. And it sort of bounced that between us while we were eating our eggs and
Bill?
Yeah.
So do you
leave
want
it to Bill
want-
and Andrew to carry on.
So, okay, so do you want me to answer that question, or I
Let
wait
him
for
go
question?
first.
I think, okay, it's fine. Okay,
You go
you're supposed
first.
to ask me a question.
Okay. Well, we know something, and I know something about your dad's later life, of course,
Yes.
and his work. But in particular, I was wondering, as Brian and I said, we were talking about, did your dad ever say much about those very early years in Russia?
Oh, yes.
And,
Absolutely,
and
yes.
how they affected him, and
Yes.
I guess he, and something about his family, which I really don't know much about. But I guess he and the family got out just as Stalin was really clamping down on.
No, they got out way before Stalin. They left between the two revolutions. There was the March Revolution, which was the Kerensky Revolution, which would probably established a government, a sort of a constitutional monarchy with a czar and some sort of democratically elected legislature, and the November Revolution, which was the one that brought in Lenin.
Okay, so
You see, that's when my grandfather, otherwise known as Julius J. Bolotowsky or Yuri Ilyich Bolotowsky, decided things are going very bad. And so they first were in the city of Baku, which was then still part of Russia, but they left and went to Georgia. And Georgia at that point was independent. It was not part of the Soviet, there was no Soviet Union yet. And it was independent, and they were there first where they stayed with one of my grandmother's sisters. Actually, two of my grandmother's sisters, who I never saw, I don't have any pictures of them, both married Georgians. And so they stayed with one of them who lived in the mountains, and they were there for a while, and then they made their way to Turkey. And at that point, they were trying to figure out, my grandfather was trying to figure out what school to enroll my father in. And so far, he had only had tutors, he had never had a so-called formal education. And so my grandfather first went to Roberts College, which was founded by an American, and but he didn't like it because he said they were all playing football all the time, and that's all they were interested in. And way before the things that they've been discovering about the dangers of football, my grandfather said that softens the brain. That's what he felt. So he enrolled my father in Collège Saint-Joseph, which, and the collège in the French tradition is sort of like, it's not really college and it's not really high school. It's something in between the two. And that's where my father went to school. And it was all run by the Frères Chrétiens, Christian brothers, although my father always liked to say he was educated by the Jesuits, because if he said I was educated by the Christian brothers, they think they're a bunch of winemakers. And so it was just easier to say they were Jesuits. It was just easier. And he had to learn, he said he had to learn French in 6 weeks, which he did. He said, which gave him terrible headaches, but he did. And which meant an entirely new alphabet and a new language and everything else. And he was not Catholic, but he was their best student. And so they cut him a lot of slack. And he said what helped him was he had a photographic memory, and he memorized 150 Catholic prayers from memory. And if anybody went after him, he would start, doing mostly prayers of the fruit of the Virgin Mary's womb, on and on and on about things of that sort. And he would do fine. He had no trouble at all. At one point, he broke his leg, and he was being bothered by some other student who would pester him as he went to school with crutches. And at a certain point, he was well, and they cut off his cast, but he put it on for one more day with his crutches, and that student came back. And my father, surprise, surprise, took off the cast, took the crutches, and beat the student with the crutches. And that was sort of, that's what he said the atmosphere was like. He said there were monks who took their vows seriously, who he said were crazy. They were absolutely crazy. They took their vows seriously. And then there were other monks who didn't take their vows seriously, and they would go, he said, always in threes to a local brothel, and then one of the three would confess. And he said, but they were regular guys. Okay. Now I'll bring in part of the question that Brian asked. I'm sorry, which had to do with.
Are we getting this down?
Okay, which had to do with why my father became the painter he became. Well, he actually drew from a very early age. I have drawings of his that he did when he was 7 and 8 and 8, and they're remarkably realist. I mean, they're incredible. Street scenes in the city of Baku, pictures of dogs in the street, things of that sort. All very tiny, little cards, things like that. But there was a so-called art course taught by one of the monks, which was essentially a sort of mechanical drawing course, and they were taught to draw spheres and cones and cubes, very academic with very thick, soft leaded pencils and things like that. He said they were incredibly boring to do. He says, but he wondered whether that sort of led him to the neoplastic style. I don't know. But of course, that was always, if you remembered about him, that he would always say something very serious and then give you a little wink indicating I'm only kidding. And of course, you never were quite sure where he was going with something. Generally, if he was speaking in a very, very soft, subdued voice, that meant he was serious. That was very serious. If he was very noisy and demonstrative and stuff, he was putting you on, as a rule. Yeah. Now, wait, someone has a question.
What was your grandfather's, how did he earn a living?
He was a lawyer.
Oh.
He was a lawyer, and he met my grandmother because he was a medical student. Now, this was unusual. My grandmother also went to university, too. They were both Jews. This was not allowed in Tsarist Russia, but if you were incredibly smart and academically very, very capable, they would make exceptions. And so both of them were exceptional people. My grandfather was in medical school. He met my grandmother and complained bitterly about, that he couldn't stand taking urine tests. He couldn't stand it. So she asked him, well, what did he want to do? He said, I think I want to study law instead. So in any case, my grandmother said, well, get together with me, marry me, and I will support you. And so you can go through law school. And that's exactly what happened. And then he became a lawyer for the Nobel Oil Company in Baku. That's why they moved there. In other words, they were first in St. Petersburg. That's where my father was born. But because they were Jews, they were not really allowed to live either in Moscow or St. Petersburg. My other grandfather also lived in Moscow, my mother's father. But he apparently had a steamer trunk, and he would live in the steamer trunk. And whenever the authorities would come and say, you're not supposed to be here, he'd say, well, I'm not living here. I'm in transit going somewhere. I mean, these were sort of the accommodations that people made. This was part of what life was like. Anyhow, he was a lawyer for the Nobel Oil Company, and that's why they were there. And of course, they have lots of oil fields right outside of Baku. Yeah.
So the family comes to this country in 1923.
That's right.
Yeah, I think this background is important to thinking about the paintings. And they came right to New York and settled in New York, I gather. Is that?
That's correct. Yeah, they came to New York, and some distant relative who sponsored them took them on a sort of a tour of New York City, and then also took them to get ice cream sodas. And my father said that they took them down this rather sort of stodgy street that he thought by, Constantinople standards, because at that time, at least in Constantinople, everything was built with white stone, everything was very gray. He thought that he was in a slum, and the slum that he was on was Park Avenue. Then he thought that this relative was punishing him by making him drink soap. And soap was actually an ice cream soda made with ginger ale. But for his taste, he thought it was soap. It took a while for him to get used to the cultural, yes. Yeah.
And then he goes, he starts studying at the National Academy?
That's right.
Yeah, right.
That's right.
Right, which is still, as you know, up there on 90th Street and still going.
I don't think it is, actually. That's the funny thing, but just in the past year. but I'm not
Did they
sure.
close it up?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I know, it's terrible.
Yeah.
It's terrible. Yeah. He went to the National Academy because it was tuition free.
Yeah.
That was the
Okay.
reason. So he was there, he stayed as long as he could, which was like about 9 years or something like that. So it's something a long, long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who were his teachers? Did he talk about them at all?
He simply said that they were very sort of well-behaved, well-meaning Victorians.
Right.
And that painted that he said every single one of them was terribly afraid of pure color. You know, everything had to be incredibly subdued. He made mention of Charles Hawthorne for several reasons.
Yeah, sure.
Hawthorne actually sponsored William Henry Johnson, because William Henry Johnson should have got a prix de Rome and gotten to go there, but he was black, and so they weren't going to give him the money. So Hawthorne gave him the money, which was very unusual.
Yeah.
Hawthorne is also the inventor of something called the Hawthorne brush. Which I think my father had one. It was a brush with one hair. And that's so when you did portraits and you had to put that little twinkle in the eye, you know, that little dot of white paint, bing, you'd have this brush with one hair, go bing, like that. That was it.
Yeah. And then, when does he first see abstract art? Did he talk about that? I mean, the Gallatin collection was installed down at NYU in
Yes.
1928, and then there's the Société Anonyme show
Yes.
in 1926 in Brooklyn, which were both important events. Did he ever, do you know if he got there to see those, or?
I don't know if he went at the
Yeah.
initial shows, but he
Yeah.
certainly mentioned both places. He said,
Yeah.
he sort of would say with humor the name Société Anonyme. He said everybody knew who was behind it. It was Catherine Dreyer
Yeah.
and Marcel Duchamp, you
Duchamp.
know, and that was it. But they were anonymous.
Yeah.
And
Well, that was Duchamp, and Man Ray was involved too. That was
Yes.
that way of calling it in French the art company.
I see,
Yeah,
okay.
So, or the art store.
Uh-huh.
But it was, it's not that well known. The collection is at Yale. It's a wonderful collection of modernism picked by artists who were living through it, Duchamp and Man Ray. And Catherine Dreyer, she gave her collection to Yale, and as well as the Société Anonyme things. And it really was enormously important to the 1920s and then later in this country. And it's still, now they hang it at Yale. I did my grad work at Yale and they didn't hang a thing. And it was all down in the basement. And, Patrick Henry Bruce's 1916 compositions were just literally flaking off. And I would pick up the chips of paint, put them in an envelope, and take them up to the director and say, here, in case you ever get around to fix it. Or he's not like me. But it was also, I think this is a point I'd like to make about Bolotowsky's work. This was in the 50s when Andrew Ritchie was director, and he had come from the Museum of Modern Art, and he, as with everybody else, was really into the burgeoning painterly abstraction, that is abstract expressionism, which swept up all the attention. And to this day too, when you talk about the 50s, people automatically assume you're talking about Pollock, de Kooning, and Klein. Now they're great artists, obviously. I mean, I'm not quarreling with that. But what happened is that terrific artists like Bolotowsky just got lost in that tidal wave. And in a time when and there had been, they say, something of a reaction against Mondrian. Well, clearly Bolotowsky picked up on Mondrian and did something very personal with it. The problem is whenever we see a straight line, people say, aha, Mondrian, no matter how different it is. And I refer you to this and to these other pictures here, which will suggest Mondrian, but that's not the issue. The issue is what Bolotowsky did with it himself. So, did he get to know Mondrian? Mondrian gets here in 1940.
Oh yes, yes. He had a,
Tell us about that.
well, he had a wonderful story about that a group of people, gosh, what was his name? Harry Holtzman called up a group of people to go with him and Mondrian to a sort of a cabaret in Times Square. And they all went, and everybody in the cabaret, it was a noisy but sort of a stylish place, began clapping. And Mondrian thought it was for him. So he stood up and took a bow. And it turned out it wasn't for him. It was for the actor Robert Young, who became famous as Marcus Welby, MD. He said, my father said this young man with this sort of saccharine smile stood up and sort of smiled wanly at everybody, and that's who they were applauding. Yeah, it was Marcus Welby, MD. Yes, father knows best. But this is way before all of that. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So,
Was he close with Mondrian? Mondrian was hardly that close too, but he was the kind of.
I mean, I don't think he was as close to Mondrian as, for instance, Harry Holtzman was.
Holtzman.
You know, I mean that's
Yeah.
it. But I mean, very much so. And he managed to wrangle a furlough so he could go to Mondrian's funeral, among other things. My father.
Your father?
My father, yeah. My father was in the Army.
In the service.
My father was in the U.S. Army Air Corps, and he was at that point stationed in Nome, Alaska. So he had to come all the way back from Nome, Alaska to get to this funeral. Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So he did, that's.
Yes, yeah, that's right. But that was very difficult. I don't know how he never discussed how he did it, but he did it.
Yeah. Did your father have any experiences in the service that affected him? I mean, his service has got to, but I mean, in terms of the long run,
Well, he had already experienced warfare in the First World War because of being in Baku. Baku had been under siege. I'll have to backtrack to this. Baku had been under siege by the Turkish army. The Turks were on the side of the Germans at that point. And the city was defended by a garrison of 100 British soldiers. And my father said they were mostly sepoys, meaning that they're Indians, with Irish and Scottish officers. And every day they would stop firing, the British, and have tea. I don't know what that is, 4 and 5. And the Turks would stop firing, thinking that they had to prepare for some secret attack by the British. Okay. And he said the guns that the Turks had were amazing. He said they would fire, they'd hit a building, and they would take a corner off a building. And then ultimately the British had to surrender because they were trying to get the local population to defend themselves. Nothing was happening, and they really couldn't go on. So the entire British force presented the Turkish force with a key for the city, which was basically a piece of cardboard wrapped up in tin foil in a sort of an elaborate ceremony, and they all got on one tugboat and sailed off. That's what happened. The Turks waited a while, and they didn't do this themselves. They had Janissary troops, they had Kurds. It's funny now that the Turks don't like the Kurds, because at that point, they're very much allied with the Kurds. And the Kurds came into the city and promptly began massacring Armenians. And my father saw that. And then they were also shooting up every which way. And my grandfather said, we have to go somewhere that's safe. So they went into the family library, which was, all 4 walls were lined with books, and they laid down on the floor. And when they got up, when this particular aspect of things was over, they got up, they were all alive, and the books were all, they took all the bullets. which meant that the bullets were all low velocity, thank God. Okay, they might be high caliber, but they're low velocity. So that's the first thing. He was very much affected by, the Second World War. Although there was no actual combat, his job was to translate from English into Russian for a program which nobody wants to discuss, which was that we, the United States, gave or lent aircraft to the Soviet Union in their fight against the Germans on the Western Front. And the way they could get it easily was that far east, by picking up their P-38 fighter bombers from Nome, Alaska, and fly them across the Bering Straits and into Siberia, and then on further west to the Western Front. And that's what that was about. And so they needed someone who could translate in the conning tower, or whatever they call it, so they could, for directions on landing and things of that sort. And it was mostly, as my father said, it was things like this. The American commander would say something like, "Tell that lousy commie son of a bitch," whatever. And so my father would say, "The American commander begs to disagree." and it was like, and then of course the communist one would say, "Tell that capitalist," and of course the Soviet commandant begs to differ. You know, and that was what my father did, basically. And then he actually wrote a play about it.
Really?
Yeah, he wrote a play. My father wrote plays too, and he wrote a play specifically about being in Alaska, stuff like that. I mean, it was, they were very tough people. There was someone there who was actually not part of the Army Air Force, but part of the Army, who was there to assigned to fixing aircraft, who was a mobster. He was an absolute mobster. Tony Provenzano, otherwise known as Tony Pro. Tony Pro, okay, he was there. And he got into an argument with one of the other people there who was a translator named Boris Tamarin. Boris Tamarin was an actor who later taught acting at Juilliard. And everybody had to protect Tamarin from being killed because Tony Pro had it in for Boris Tamarin. And finally, that was resolved, but it was a whole thing for a while with that. And at one point, I think my father gave an interview with someone about that and mentioned it, and then said, "Oh my God," because Tony Pro was still very much alive, and he didn't want that discussed. I mean, you just simply didn't discuss things like that. That's it.
Did any of the plays get produced?
Yes, as a matter of fact, there was a play called Visitation, which was about a family. It was actually based on our experience of leaving Wyoming. A family being, visited by a woman who was a Swedish pietist. And she was very, very religious. I remember, and she was talking about how she actually talked to God. And she would give God lectures that he had to clean up his act, and things of that sort, and so on. And so the play direction, as I recollect, was God appears in the play as sort of above the set, and he had to look like a well-dressed Karl Marx. That was the stage direction how he was supposed to look. In any case, that's one play that was done. There was another one that's a one-woman play with about 17 different roles, and that's called Darling, Poor Darling. And that was actually done at the Guggenheim when he had his show at the Guggenheim.
74.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, okay.
That's right.
Yeah. Huh.
And there were terrific arguments, and that had music involved in it too. And there was a director who was very much of the ilk that this is all fantasy. The woman has fantasies, and my father was arguing with him. Look, you have to think like the woman. It's real, okay? Don't say, "Oh, it's all fake. We don't have to worry about it. It's all in her head." No, it's real because that's how she felt. It's real, and so they had terrific arguments about. Oh, at least that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
I don't have to think about that anymore.
This is Andrew. It was interesting you mentioned early on his observation that the his early tutors were not using color at all.
That's right.
Yeah, and because one of the really great things about your dad's work is his use of color. And as I sit here and all of you can see, I mean, he's a great colorist. And that's something that Mondrian, as you know, limited himself to 5 colors, the primaries in black and white, and that was it. And clearly your dad goes way beyond that.
Yes.
And picks up on color. Well, if he's interested in it in the 20s, that's really fascinating. And he does something with color that I mean, a kind of intensity that is, I think, is unique for an abstract painter. I mean, I would go with that. I mean, it's just really, really intense. And it is, speak to me anyway, color like that speaks about to the joy and harmony of life. And I wanted to, you know, we always, all this stuff we hear about people who say that geometric art is cold, impersonal, unfeeling. It's just so wrong. And you have to, if you come and actually look at the paintings, you can see it. And I'm interested for many reasons, but the fact that your dad was involved in 2 wars, not just plus the revolutions, right? Yeah. So he knows what warfare is.
Yes. Well,
And,
yeah.
Well, let me
Okay.
but so then he, in this little, in Joan's little brochure, there's a statement, I can give you all sorts of reasons which may be completely false about why I prefer to paint in the neoplastic style. It is my own reaction to whatever I experience. And, okay, after I went through a lot of violent historical upheavals in my life, I came to prefer a search for an ideal harmony and order, which is still a free order, not militaristic, not symmetrical, not goose-stepping, not academic, you see. That this is my taste. But I'm really interested in that the artists, and clearly your dad united himself related to it, who sought not to express the violence and discontinuity of modern life, but rather a sense of the harmony and the possibilities and the hope of modern art in a kind of ever-shifting balance. And, you know, your dad's writings speak of that, and Mondrian, of course, talked about that all the time, that we seek a new kind of balance, which was meant to restore order and harmony to the world after the disaster of World War I, which wiped out the old order. And in the aftermath of that war, communal movements like the style of Mondrian, constructivism, the Bauhaus, sought a kind of communal harmony that literally could change the world physically as well as spiritually. I think it's really useful to put your dad's work in that general branch. Did he ever talk more about that and those ideas, or? Yeah.
Well, yes. I mean, the thing is that we all are complex individuals.
Yes, yeah.
and so, yes. At the same time, if he wanted to do something that wasn't part of that, he would make an experimental film, which was very much influenced by surrealism, you see, plus Greek mythology. Or he'd write a play, you see, or he'd express himself in some other way. I was talking to a gentleman in the audience who actually shared loft space with him, John Paul, about someone. I asked him whether he knew someone at Yale who later became a faculty member at the University of New Mexico. He was a young man, about your height, or so, or even taller, and he was 30 years old, and he did something where he irritated my father big time. And so my father went after him. My father was about my height, maybe a little shorter, and my father beat him up, and which was quite amazing to see. What he did was he picked him up by his belt, and he threw him over like you throw the trash out of a trash bin, and he threw him down the stairs, just like that. And I was like, oh my God. And then he looked at me and he said, well, that wasn't so impressive. He said, I knew I had the reach on him, and I knew that I was heavier, and because I'm shorter, my center of gravity was lower. And I mean, he had it all figured out. I mean, just like that. And of course, this is part of it. If you went to apparently the arts, the art school he was in, they all were fighting. They were all poor students, and they were all fighting over paints. They were all stealing paints. So they would have the philosophy, as you described, whatever they were, to believe in. But at the same time, there were practical aspects that would change things, you know. Yeah.
There's the philosophic basis of life,
Then there's the reality.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that he also learned from being in the army. You know, there were things like that too.
Sure.
He was in Nome. He mentioned to me that there was a clergyman there that nobody liked. Apparently, he was an awful person. So one day, going between the different sheds and buildings that they were in, someone just held him down and opened up his parka. And I guess held him there for maybe 20 minutes. And so the guy froze to death.
Oh, good.
That's
the army.
That's the Army. And that's the U.S. Army Air Corps. So that's the kind of stuff that would happen. You know, that was also part of the Army.
Yeah. Really tough.
Yeah.
Tough stuff. Tell us, I know your family lived out in Wyoming for a while.
That's right.
And that's something I don't know about. Can you tell us something about that?
Well, actually, there were a bunch of artists, New York artists, who ended up teaching there. Although my father probably was there for the longest period. He was there for 10 years. But there was George McNeil was there, and a surrealist painter named Leon Kelly was there. That's right.
Yeah.
And of course, we knew both of them before they were in Wyoming. And they had a man who taught, his name was Robert Russell. He did a rather simply dreadful head of Abraham Lincoln, which stands outside of Laramie. You get to this high point before you drive into the town, and this head, it's about 8 or 9 feet tall, and it's, well, I'll just say it's awful, but we'll leave it at that. That's me being nice. Anyhow, but he did a movie actually about them too, about Wyoming, about being in Wyoming. He called it his Western. It's called Sand Creek. It was about how Mother Nature gets mad at humanity. Humanity was represented by the faculty of the University of Wyoming, and humanity kills Mother Nature, and she gets mad and connives with, because she's not to be killed, she's nature, she connives with the devil and comes back on a wagon wheel. It's an incredible visual image, and she's in the nude, and she's in profile on this wagon wheel spinning, and she's sort of like this, and she's leading an army of sheep, and the sheep overwhelm humanity and destroy humanity. Now, when he showed the film to the faculty, of course, he had to do major editing, you see. We had to remove Mother Nature and the all together. But it was a very effective film.
Are these films still in existence?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, yes. Yeah, but Wyoming was, he liked Wyoming. He fit in very well there. He taught a class either on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday evening, which was for the locals, and it was mostly ranchers' wives. And the ranchers' wives, he says, I never had to explain the idea, the basic concept of abstraction. They understood. They understood it intuitively, and well, it wasn't intuitive. They all collected, well, I call them now Native American rugs. Then we call them Indian rugs. Okay, but those are, now it's Native American rugs. They all collected them and even advised him on rugs to purchase, which we did. And my father sent them back to his mother, who then sent a note to him saying, these rugs could not have been done by the Aboriginal peoples of North America. This is my grandmother, who was very smart, okay? And he said, well, who mother did these rugs if not the Aboriginal peoples of North America? And she said, oh, easy. Russian DPs who spend time in Germany going to Bauhaus schools, learning figure-ground relationships and Gestalt psychology, which shows you how a little knowledge can be a bad thing.
I wonder too if being out there affected your dad's sense of space. Well, the more I look at this painting, you can just see that kind of American vastness and that sense of an endless landscape.
We also spent half a year at the University of New Mexico. And actually, that was in particular very noteworthy. It was like a whole bunch of paintings from that period, immediately, 1970 through about 74, were all very open, very white, quite beautiful.
The white
Yes,
pictures,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, he had an argument with the department chairman, who was a photographer named Van Daren Koch, because Koch, he was. I'll talk about him later in private. But anyhow, he gave my father a studio where all of the windows were painted in. He had 3 walls of windows. They were all painted in. And my father said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Oh," and Darren Cook said, the lights. And my father said, the light. And that was it. He loved the light.
Sure.
You know, there was an elderly artist there named, Raymond Johnson. Raymond Johnson. He was living there with his brother, Arthur Johnson. And Raymond Johnson was sort of emeritus. They gave him a house on campus. They turned it into a museum of his artwork, and he was sort of a curator of his own artwork. And actually, the Johnsons described how their first exposure to European art were little postcards of great masterpieces, all done in sepia. He said, and you know, could you imagine, he said, that this was actually Johnson's brother, Arthur, saying, can you imagine when we actually saw the actual work that it was in color? He said, what a revelation, you know? Exactly.
That's, what years was he in Wyoming?
1947
47?
to 1957.
Okay.
And then there was a space in between where we came to New York for a year in the mid-50s because he had a sabbatic leave, and he taught at Brooklyn College. And and that was very nice. That was
That it kind of reminds me of a story about Stuart Davis. John Sloan urged him to go to New Mexico in the summer of 1923, and Davis really loved Sloan, so he took his advice, and he gets there, and they gave him a prime studio in the main closet. But Davis didn't like all the light and all this landscape. It was filled with too much sentiment and history. So he went downstairs into the basement and found tin cans and saws and painted those. And he made some of his best ever paintings. Not bad, but of the time. They're amazing pictures. But the mayor of Santa Fe got very upset when he got wind of this, and he went to see Davis and said, you know, Mr. Davis, we brought you down here, we gave you this special studio, and so you could revel in our glorious landscape, which Davis hated. And so, and he said, you haven't been out to paint it once, and Davis didn't want to embarrass Sloan, so he went out and ripped off about 10 pictures, which are among the worst he ever did.
Oh, dear. Well,
go on.
we liked New Mexico, and here again, my father liked the light and did a movie
Yeah.
also in New Mexico. And we used on the West Mesa, they were putting up a housing project, which it was called Rio Rancho Estates. And the first time we went to Rio Rancho Estates was to get a dog. Some family was giving up their dog, and we had lost our dog, and so we couldn't get this dog. And we got into this dust storm, and it's a little hard to describe what a dust storm is like, but it's awful. It's like, imagine all of this brown swirl, and you cannot see anything. And we found our way to a gas station where the gas station owner was German. And even though my father was Russian, he looked at him as a European and proceeded to let forth in German about Mein Gott and all the devils and everything else. So we got our dog. But we decided to do a movie there on the West Mesa, and it was all about a sort of a suburban American couple in the midst of all this space, endless space. There was also a lot of nudity in this film. And we shot in a abandoned, although it was actually a national park south of Albuquerque by about 50 miles. It was a Spanish cathedral. And we were filming there on a weekday, and we thought it would be safe doing it. And I had to do this shot where I was the cameraman. The main character was in the foreground, basically his head, but in the background were these two nude women acting like they were teasing him. You know, it had to be, and it was great because of the light. I could shut down the lens so small that I could get that kind of depth of field. It was incredible. In comes a bus, a school bus, with 30 school children. So my father says to me, you keep shooting, I'll take care of it. Okay, so he goes out to meet the bus, and he takes control, which is something that he could do. If you knew my father, you knew that that's what he was like. He would just take control, and no one would question anything. And he acted like he was a park ranger. And he proceeded to give a lecture on Spanish art, Spanish churches, the design of churches, the Christ figure throughout art. Oh, it was an incredible art history lecture. And wherever they were in their lecture, we weren't. And so we sort of followed this spiral kind of pattern where I was shooting where they weren't, and that's it. They never knew what was going on. It was fun. It ultimately, but he held forth, and I just took the shots that he told me to take, and we were successful in avoiding kind of problems, so to speak. But it was quite I wish I had a recording of his lecture, because again, he was someone who was very well read. He could give a lecture on anything at the drop of a hat. You talked about Yale University. He had a friend who was the assistant department chairman, George Wardlaw, and Wardlaw would invite him to give lectures, and so he told my father to give a lecture on this, and so we're driving to Yale, and I asked my father, did you prepare your lecture? And my father's the one driving. He says, oh, I'm writing it right now. You know? And it was just as good that he did it that way, because we got there, and then Wardlow says, you know, we decided you shouldn't lecture on this, but you should lecture on that. And he just did it. That was it. Sort of off the top of his head, he could just do it. That was his nature. He liked to read. He read all the time. He was seemingly up on everything. He had the ability to sort of get to the essence of a particular argument. You know, you have all these things flying around with concepts, and he'd give you, this is what it really is about.
Yeah, are there aspects of your father's art or his thinking that you remember and believe that we don't know enough about, or maybe we don't know at all, that really ought to be part of the conversation about him and his work?
He was very enthusiastic. He had a lot of energy. He also saw the dark side of everything, and at the same time, it didn't deter him from wanting to do things. That's it. In other words, he believed you had to look at things realistically, and he would. That was his nature. If he went to the doctor, somehow he would have a better diagnosis than the doctor, and the doctor would just let him go with his diagnosis. And then my father would tell the doctor what he should prescribe, and the doctor would say, "Oh, okay, yeah, why not?" that was his nature. That's what he was like. If you want an idea of kind of what he was like, I mean, all of these paintings, of course, are him, that's it. I would say, when I looked at this one in particular, I said, that really is him. I mean, there's this logic, and at the same time, there's this fire, sort of going, this intensity, like this sort of energy.
Yeah.
It reminds me of something that he did. He was a senior citizen. He had to retake his driver's test, the visual test, and he flunked. Okay, what did you say, Dad? Why did you flunk? Well, they asked me about the colors. Okay, like, it's easy enough. It's just, it's red, blue, yellow. That's all you have to say. Now, of course, I might not get the colors wrong. He looks at blue and he says ultramarine. Okay. He looks at the red and I think he said cadmium medium. He looked at the yellow and he said cadmium light. I said, look, you're a smart ass and you just got yourself in trouble. I said, go back, take it again, and give them what they want to hear. Red, blue, yellow, that's it. Oh, really? Yes, really. Okay.
Looking at this painting, speaking of reds, Joseph Albers famously said that if you ask 20 people to put down a red, you'd get 20 different reds.
Mm-hmm.
And the more I look at this picture, I'm up to 8 so far. And I mean, but it gives the painting a kind of vibrancy within this structure that seems to shift. I mean, that's, and you'll see that in the other pictures too. There may be more questions or comments on,
I have a question.
Mrs. Washburn, yes.
You talked about many things, but what about Miro?
Yeah.
What about Miro?
Yeah. Well,
I mean, did he know Miro?
No, he didn't know
No,
Miro.
I didn't think so.
No.
So was it because of Pierre Matisse's shows?
Probably that's the case.
Because they were every 2 years.
Yeah. I mean, there were certain developments which were sort of modernistic developments. So, for instance, when he was still a student, there was this black student, William Henry Johnson, who was infatuated with Soutine. And as a result of Johnson's influence on my father went through a Soutine-like phase too.
Did he ever mention that in such a transition?
He didn't even necessarily call it Miro. He would simply say biomorphic. Biomorphic, you see.
Okay.
In fact, I think he's been irritated in certain things. For instance, in the Guggenheim show, he was irritated by the fact that they didn't do enough treatment of the biomorphic phase of his artwork, because they took a sort of an art historical viewpoint, which is that there's a direction that you follow. You see your North Star, and you're always heading towards your North Star. And he says it's not like that.
I remember
Yeah.
that he was.
Yeah, he was very irritated
He had
by
to
that.
argue with him.
And there was another art historian who will remain nameless at this point, who also basically was regarding all of this as somehow not fully developed, but he felt it was fully developed, and he is, and he was perfectly happy in this style doing it as long as he was doing it.
Does anybody else have a question?
Yes.
yeah.
Well, did he do the biomorphics and the geometrics simultaneously?
No.
They're
There was
sequential. Yeah.
sequential. There is a period where you'll have there's a painting at the Carnegie Art Institute that has a couple of biomorphic elements in with the geometric. Yeah, but that's very rare.
Well, did he ever talk about the transition from, biomorphic to geometric is a pretty It's a serious,
Can I make a comment to that?
Yes,
He called it biomorphic cubism, so it was still part of cubism for him. And if you look at Picasso, it's geometric, you know, those early ones with the parallel lines, and so that was the language. That was the modern language at that time.
Yeah.
The vocabulary.
You know, I'm just thinking too, another thing that happens to American painters who are working in style suggestive of others is that we assume it's derivative. But what we don't understand is, you think it is, but then when you hold the picture up like that up to a real Miro, the differences are amazing.
yeah.
And so you gotta look hard and really think about things. There was a great famous art historian named Henri Faucillon. He was French. He really started the art history department at Yale. And he wrote in 1932, I think, a book that's not read much anymore, but it's been reissued. It's called The Life of Forms in Art. And he talks about organicism and the growth of forms. And I think that that really ties in with an interest in biomorphs and evolution and kind of nature studies even. So, yeah, anyone else? Yeah, Paul.
Peter, was there any relation to Burgoyne Diller?
Oh, yes. Yes, they knew each other quite well. As a matter of fact, Burgoyne Diller was head of the mural project on the WPA. And it was thanks to Burgoyne Diller that my father had the murals that he did on the WPA, because Diller was the director of that program.
Yeah, that's a good.
Yeah.
Diller was really important because during the 30s, art was supposed to be socially active, social realism, American scene, et cetera, what Gordon called poor art for poor people. But there was also, throughout the 30s, a definite abstract trend, not more than trend, but real vein, of which his dad was one, Stuart Davis was another, Diller was another, and together they formed the American Abstract Artists in 1938, a group that banded together to promote and show and discuss this kind of abstract art. Excuse me. So it's there all along, but it was neglected for so long. In 1968, Joe mentioned this, I did a show at the Whitney Museum on the 30s in America, and I showed a lot of abstract art. I should have just called it abstract art in America, but that's neither here nor there. That show, including Stuart Davis, Bolotowsky, Diller, and others, that show was excoriated by every living soul in the city of New York and beyond. There's only one guy who really stood up for it, and that was Harry Holtzman. But Howard Rosenberg wrote 10 pages just tearing that show apart. And he said something amazing, though. He said, this show is too good for the period. I mean, that's a kind of form of self-hatred because Rosenberg, the failed lefty. Anyway, this stuff was buried for so long. And it's thanks to people like Joan, it's the last few years, it's really beginning
It must have been a great
resurface.
show if you offended so many people.
Pardon?
It must have been a terrific show if you offended so many people.
Well, thank you.
Well,
I thought that maybe. Well, I hit a nerve, and But this was 30 years after the fact, and given the turmoil that was going on in the late 60s, I thought it would be relevant to show how politics don't always determine the content or style of painting.
No.
And, well, I was the only person who saw it that way. And the directors of the museum were so embarrassed, they set up post haste a afternoon of debate where you had to sign up to come to the microphone to shout me down and the show. And they were lined up down in the lobby.
Oh, gosh.
So yeah, I mean, I touched some kind of nerve, but for sure. But I'm still glad I did it. I have that. People moan about getting bad press. I said, let me show you bad press. Anybody else?
My goodness, I know there are questions burning. I can feel it. You know, it's sort of like an oven that's still on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
Ask it,
Jim.
yeah.
When I look at your dad's paintings, I've been lucky enough to see quite a few of them. I'm always amazed with the geometric ones how the shapes seem to actually have energy in them. They seem to be moving, contending with each other, not in a violent way, but in an energetic way. Did your father do that on purpose?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all I can say. I mean, yes. I mean, he was interested in color. He was interested in the weight that colors would have and their relationships. And he would play around with it. And again, he would have fun with it. I don't think he ever devised this sort of a scientific thing for all of that, because that would take away the fun. You see, in other words, if you figure out a formulation and then you just simply are applying formulations all the time, where's the fun? And he liked the sense of play. He always had that in him. In other words, if you look at these and you think, oh, this is a very strict man. Quite the contrary, not at all. Not at all. Yes, John.
I would say he knew the center of the canvas without making a marker measurement, and
That's
he'd
right.
work off that.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
center. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's- John, what else do you have to say about his painting? These are very interesting comments you've made.
Well, you know, he's a great painter, great human being. I miss him. Learned a lot. A lot of things about what the art world was then, you know, confidentially. And we'd stay up late. We'd be drinking this Persovka, this, you know, stone pepper vodka. And his mom would make tea, and we would still be rehearsing his flute, and the dog Max would be slouching around, farting and begging for something.
That's right.
Wasn't that it?
That was it. That was it, basically, yeah. The dog would position himself in back of my father, because if my father had a scrap, he would throw it over his shoulder, and the dog was there. That was, they had a relation. Yes.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about his experimental films and how that related to his work as a painter? And
Well,
also,
who
were
okay.
the films made for? Were they shown? to
They were made for him. He wanted to do them, and they were shown in various places. He was part of, what was it called? Cinema 16. He had one film with them. They're long gone. That went around to various colleges. It was called Metanoia. The films had nothing to do with the paintings, not at all. They were very surrealist. They would have, if there was a plot line, it would oftentimes be based on Greek mythology. That's something that he liked to do. It would sort of, the plot line would develop. He never started with a script. He'd start with people he thought were interesting. And then what he would do is he would start shouting commands, do this, do that. There were never any rehearsals, he said, because what happens is, once you get into rehearsals, everybody gets stiff. People do it, he says, people do it naturally the first time, and then you go through rehearsals to get them back to that which they had initially. So he would just do it. He would just start yelling things. And people might be uncomfortable initially with that, but then they'd fall into pattern. You know, that was what would happen. As I grew older, then I became the cameraman, and he would just shout the orders. And that's what we did.
We showed a film, one of our exhibitions.
That's right.
And
You
then
showed-
actually, we could do it here later on when it's dark. Maybe in January, the beginning of January.
Okay, I
Something.
mean, there are ways we can
I mean, we
do
could
it.
block, you know,
Yeah,
there-
yes, yes.
it's still too light.
Yeah.
There was one thing I wanted to mention, and that is his influence as a teacher and the influence of his
Mhm.
art. Your dad was teaching at the famous school in North Carolina.
Black Mountain College.
Black Mountain
for
College,
2 years.
right?
That's right.
2 years.
2 years.
In the late 40s, I think.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Well, Kenneth Nolan, an artist I've done some work on and very much
That's right.
admire, in his standard biographies, it's always listed that he took Joseph Albers' color class. But Nolan insisted that Albers was not there that term, and it was Bolotowsky
That's correct.
that he learned all the
That's
color
correct.
from.
That's correct.
And he
That's right.
really was insistent on that.
Yes.
And he talked about Bolotowsky's color.
Well,
And you can, all you have to do is look at this picture.
well, my father said about Ken Nolan that he had a natural color sense,
Yeah.
just like that.
There you go.
And it was his friend Clement Greenberg who advised him, erase Bolotowsky, make sure that it's Albers. That's it. And it's only through the passage of time that that's been corrected. That's really what it was.
Yeah.
People will gravitate towards Albers' name, who's Bolotowsky, and that's what it was.
But Ken always
Yes,
insisted on that.
I know, I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
I'm aware of that. There were a number of other people. The thing is that my father was not interested in starting a sort of a school with a sort of prescription of what you should do to become an artist. And Albers was very much into that. In other words, he sort of codified a system of how to become a modern artist immediately. And my father insisted, he didn't insist, but he said that really you should learn all the things that every artist should learn. You should learn how to draw.
Yeah.
You know, you should learn how to draw from life. You should learn how to draw from life with a time limit, you know, a whole bunch of things. You should open yourself up to doing many, many different things. So when you decide in a particular way that you want to express yourself, it's the result of a decision process that you've made that's taken some time. Not that you should be dictated to as to how you're going to do your artwork. And so there are a lot of my father's former students who are realists, precisely because, again, my father was an awfully good realist. He really was. Of course, you'll never see an example of this show, but I saw him in terms of what he could do. It was remarkable and very quick. I mean, I think that's precisely why he didn't become a realist. It was simply too easy for him. I mean, it really was. It was amazing. You know, I would ask him to do a sketch of me for a concert, for instance. You know, and so first he would sketch my mother. You know, does he say to warm up the pen? So warming up the pen. and then he would proceed, and it was very much like Rodin with sketches, which is you never look at the page, you look at the person. You say, that's it. You know, in other words, what I just did was what it would take for him to do it. You know, like that. Very kind of like Matisse kind of style of realism.
You know who talks about warming up the hand?
Yeah.
Nolan.
No, he got
He
that.
said, I draw like a pianist to loosen up. Practice the scales.
Yeah.
Practice drawing.
Yes.
Get your
Yeah.
hand loose.
Yes. Yeah.
Sure.
All right.
Well, these people have been here talking for an hour.
Oh,
15
that's
minutes.
okay.